So last time what we focused on, we looked at the characteristics of the skeletal muscle in terms of both macroscopic and microscopic. We looked at the fact that there are multiple connective tissue that are found inside the muscle that basically gives the muscle its strength. And there were, from the outside moving inside, was the perimysium, epimysium, and then, epimysium, perimysium, and then endomysium were the three layers of the connective tissue we had in the muscles. We looked at the muscle itself, and I'm just going to go back and kind of refresh your idea in terms of what we discussed. So we said if you take a muscle cell like you see in the image on the top, there is a bunch of these cylindrical structures that basically takes over up to 80% of the space inside the muscle cell or muscle fiber, and they call myofibril, which are these, basically they pull one out and they kind of zoom into these. And then if you look at the myofibril, they kind of broken down to these little smaller units called the sarcomere. So sarcomeres are basically the contractile unit of the muscle. So if you're contracting the muscles, this is at that level where you're actually going to see the muscle contraction takes place. Now, if I ask you what is a sarcomere made up of, what is a unit of sarcomere made up of? Basically, it's made up of the two myofilaments or proteins. A lot of the students forget that this is still a protein. And those two proteins are referred to as the actin and myosin, which is basically what you guys see in this picture. The blue lines that you see right here are your actin or your thin filament. And then you have your myosin with these little heads poking out, which is basically your thick filament. And the interaction between these two, that kind of tug of war concept that I gave you, myosin heads hold on to the actin and then pull it. And when it pulls, it basically causes the sarcomere to shorten. And as sarcomere shorten, then your whole muscle fiber shortens. And as a result, your fascicles shorten, and then your whole muscle shortens. So when you think about contraction, you always think about a muscle getting shorter. And I want you to understand that that shortening, that length that gets less as we contract, actually starts with the interaction that takes place between actin and myosin. So do keep that in mind, please. We also talked about the fact that the interaction that leads to muscle contraction happens because we have nerve impulses coming from the nervous system, or your brain more specifically, and that causes the, sorry, I'm gonna mute you guys. And that interaction causes the muscle to contract. And because of that contraction is, the contraction takes place in an area called neuromuscular junction, right? So which is the picture that we have here. So neuromuscular junction, this is the end of your neuron, which is your axon, going to axon terminal. You have a release of a neurotransmitter into your space called the synaptic cleft. And these neurotransmitters open up these channels called sodium-potassium channels, and causing sodium to get into your cell and potassium to get out. And these movement of the ions, which you're gonna learn a lot more in detail about them in your physiology class, that movement of sodium into the cell and potassium out of the cell causes what we call electrical impulses inside my muscle. And then we talked about the fact that these electrical impulses are going to spread very rapidly through your muscle cell by looking at these long extension called T-tubules. So T-tubules are these like blue structures, and basically the pink arrow you see are representative of the electrical impulses. This leads to the release of calcium, which you can see as these little green dots, as you can see. These little red dots. Calcium gets released into the muscle, and that allows the, I want to see the picture. That allows the actin and myosin to interact with each other and basically cause muscle contraction. Sorry, if you're not mute, please mute yourself because I don't have access to that page right now. So check your microphones. If they are on, please turn them off. Okay, so that's the basic concept we described last time. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of mention here as well on top of that is when you think about the relationship between your neurons and your muscle cells, which is what is depicted here. So the purple or the red lines that you see are representative of a nerve cell or a neuron. And then basically these are your muscle cells. You can see by just looking at this picture that it is not a 1-to-1 ratio. So basically you don't have one neuron controlling one muscle cell. Rather, you have what we call a motor unit, where one nerve cell or neuron controls multiple muscle cells. So for instance, in the picture, the red neuron that you have identified as motor unit 2 is innervating or providing nerve impulses for this muscle cell, this one, and this one, versus the purple nerve cell or neuron is innervating this muscle cell and this one. So usually what you have one neuron and number of muscle cells that are being controlled by that neuron. So the combination of this, the combination of the nerve and all of the muscle cells that are being controlled by that nerve is referred to as the motor unit, which is what we refer to it as motor unit 1 here and motor unit 2. So kind of a quick concept to connect it to what we already have an understanding. When you think about your muscles and facial expressions, do you think your facial expressions are very fine or very generic? Are they very fine movement or very generic movement? They're fine movements, right? So we call them actually micro expressions, right? So when you think about micro expressions, the motor units that are controlling those facial muscles are smaller, which means, for instance, one nerve cell or neuron controls 1 or 2 of the muscle fibers. Okay, so you have a very small ratio, which gives you a very fine movement in your facial expressions. Now think about your thigh muscles, like your quads or your hamstring, or your biceps or your triceps. These are gigantic muscles with the goal of not creating expression, rather creating force, right? You want to like lift up something, right? You want to run, you want to bike, you want to jog. So the goal of those motor units is not to make a small movement or fine movements, rather you want to create a lot of force. So if I compare the motor unit for those, you have one neuron controlling hundreds, sometimes thousands of muscle fibers. So when one neuron fires, they send their electrical impulses, then they're going to create a significant amount of electrical impulse in the skeletal muscle, and therefore in turn create what we call muscle contraction with the goal of force rather than creating fine expressions. Does this make sense to everybody, guys? Any question, anything needs clarification? Motor unit is a typical exam question, and my students usually miss this one, guys. I usually say, what's the combination of the neuron and all of the muscle cells combined together? And they just go blank. So the proper name would be a motor unit. And please, I did sign up a couple of you guys into the room. So please make sure if you haven't typed your name into the chat box, please do so you can get credit for being here. Thank you, guys. Okay, we did talk about the fascicles. So the question is, what is the combination of the nerve cell and all of the muscle fibers it controls. Sorry, I'm chatting with everybody in the meeting, not the waiting room. So hold on. Right. So here's the question, and again, the answer would be a motor unit. Somebody asked me, I think it was Jessica that asked me earlier about what causes the muscle to actually relax. So the answer to that is there's actually 3 paths or 3 things that leads to muscle relaxation. So I'm gonna type them in the chat box as well for you guys, so you guys have that information. One thing is basically the neurotransmitter NT, I'm typing NT-ACH, which is neurotransmitter acetylcholine, basically diffuse out of the neuromuscular junction. So one thing that actually stops muscles from contracting is literally the neuromuscular junction, the neurotransmitter ACH that is released into this space gets diffused out of this space. So ACH is not there. Therefore, your sodium-potassium channels that we have right here, these purple structures, are going to close up. And when they close up, basically that whole connection between the nerve fiber and the muscle gets disconnected. No connection, no muscle contraction. That's one way for the muscle to start to relax. The second thing that leads to the muscle relaxing after a contraction is uptake of the neurotransmitter by the neuron. So basically, neuron release this neurotransmitter, which is your ACH, into the synaptic cleft. And then at some point, it says, okay, I don't need to do this. So what it's going to do is literally collect it back into your cell. So neuron retake whatever it gives to the synaptic cleft. So reclaiming its neurotransmitter. Again, if there is no neurotransmitter, there is no muscle contraction. Third option that you have is literally your neurotransmitter starts to break down after a certain amount of time. So as the neurotransmitter starts to degrade or break down, again, there is no connection to the muscle cell anymore. And as a result, that causes the muscle to start to relax. Now, depending on the muscle, depending on the location, depending on the neuron, 1, 2, or all 3 methods can be used for muscle relaxation. So just as far as you know all 3 paths, you're good to go. Hopefully that answered your question, Jessica, if that was the person that asked the question. Okay. Anything else that I need to clarify for you guys so far before we move on? And everybody sees the chat box. I did type the answers for you guys in the chat box, so you guys are responsible for that information. So please go ahead and review those. Okay, we already talked about it. Okay, awesome. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about, which is kind of moving toward the end of our lecture for this one, for muscular system, is how your muscle actually gets attached to your bone for the movement that is created as a result. So anytime you think about a muscle, you always think about that there's typically 2 points of attachment. So 2 points of attachments are basically known as origin and insertion. So a lot of people immediately say, well, why do I need to have 2 names? Why can't I just call both of them origins? Why do I need to call them origin versus insertion? The reason is that when you think about the points of attachment, these points of attachments always one that is less movable versus one that is freely movable as a result of the muscle contraction. So the one that is identified as stationary or less movable, it's called the origin. And the one that actually, the ends of the muscle that actually moves during the contraction of the muscle is referred to as the insertion. So that's the one that is going to be, again, moving more freely compared to your origin. So let's take a look at a picture. So here is our muscle right here. So the muscle we have, oh, sorry, guys, I don't know what happened. So the muscle we have here is a muscle called brachialis, which is this muscle right here. Now you should already know your bone name, so that should be pretty easy to identify. So here's your arm, so that's your arm bone, which is your humerus. And the one that has that kind of a curvature that fits into the humerus, that's your ulna right here. So when you think about moving your forearm by creating the movement called flexion, which is what you see right here, this is flexing your arm, right? So when I'm doing this, I'm flexing my arm. So flexion of the arm keeps the connection to the humerus kind of immovable. This is not moving. However, the point to the ulna is moving, right? This point is moving because it's bringing the arm closer to, bringing your forearm closer to your arm. So this point of attachment in the ulna is referred to as an insertion because it's moving, versus the point that is to your humerus is identified as the origin because it's less movable. Okay, so less movable versus freely movable in terms of muscle contraction. Now, another set of words that you see here is the word direct attachment versus indirect attachment. So what's the difference there? So if you go to the next slide, we talked about the concept of how you can have the muscle literally getting connected directly into the bone. They kind of merge in together. So you can't really see where one ends and where the other one begins, versus when you have something like a tendon, which is a really clear separation between, okay, my muscle is done, here is the point of attachment, getting connected to the bone. That's referred to as an indirect attachment. So let's read the read the description. So direct or fleshy attachment is identified as when your muscle surface, right, the muscle itself, directly attached to the periosteum of the bone. Everybody remember what periosteum was? Does that sound familiar to you guys? Can anybody tell me the description of periosteum? Does it sound familiar? What does the word peri means? Around, correct. So it's around the bone. So the word peri meant around. Osteum is basically means bone. So this is the connective tissue that's wrapped around your bone. So literally what we're saying, when it's a direct or fleshy attachment, you're directly connecting your muscle into the connective tissue that's wrapped around the bone. So it's a direct relationship between your bone and your muscle. Now, most of the attachment that we have, the ones that you guys are going to see in terms of your muscles, are considered to be indirect attachment, as I'm using connective tissue, which is things like tendon or aponeurosis, to connect your muscle to your bone indirectly, okay? Now, the difference between tendon, which is something that we already heard in our earlier lecture, tendon is basically this cord-like material at the end of the muscle that connects to the bone. Aponeurosis is basically relatively wide and thin tendon. So I'll give you an example of an aponeurosis. If you look at the top of your skull, which is typically where your parietal bone is, right? You actually don't have any muscle up here on top of your head. What you have muscle is a muscle right here called frontalis, and a muscle in the back of the head called occipitalis. Basically a muscle on the frontal bone and the occipital bone. So to connect these two muscles together, you have this sheath of connective tissue on top of your head, which is called aponeurosis. And again, it still connects to the skull, right? It connects your muscles to the skull, but it's really wide. It's covering the surface of your skull. versus really narrow for the tendon. Okay, so that's the main difference in terms of what is the two type of indirect attachment. Now, when you guys were studying your bones for both appendicular and axial skeleton, something that you notice is a lot of words like tubercle, trochanter, crest, styloid process, things like this. So all of these are basically acting as points of attachment for those muscles. And they can be direct or indirect. It doesn't matter which one it is. As far as the point of attachment is basically on the surface of the bone, that is referred to as basically a marking on the surface of the bone. The majority of the connections we do have are identified as indirect attachments, which relies on either tendons or aponeurosis. Do tendons have name? Yes, they do. Do I know them? No. Do you need to know them? No. Unless you want to become an orthopedic surgeon, then yes, you do need to know them. So yeah, no, don't worry about it. Okay, so surprisingly, when it comes to anatomy, we named everything. So well, I guess it's not really surprising. Okay, so let's talk about one of the last topics. So how do I name a muscle? So you guys, as you go through the lab next week, we're starting to look at the muscles. How do we name these muscles? What guidelines did we use to come up with those names, basically? So there are typically these four different ways to name a muscle to kind of have, I guess, a more organized way of naming structures. One is location. So where is that muscle located in your body? For instance, we have a muscle, as you can see on the image on the top. It's called tibialis anterior. So if you break down the words, based on your understanding, tibialis implies the bone tibia, right? The thick bone on the bottom of your leg. And the word anterior means in front. So simply put, tibialis anterior is a muscle in front of the tibia. So the location of the muscle is basically, I should say, you're using the location of the muscle to provide a name for that muscle. Another thing that you can use is the size of the muscle. So the size of the muscle is basically, are these muscles big or small, short or long? So we have the word maximus and minimus, or major and minor, which simply means large versus a small. And then longus and brevis. So longus, automatically you think about long, which means brevis implies short. So to kind of giving you names, hopefully everybody has heard of this, gluteus maximus, right? Your butt muscle, the big butt muscle, is gluteus maximus. Another muscle that you have is gluteus medius, not minimus, medius, as in a smaller, it's in the middle. You have muscles that are forming on the forearm section of your arm on this side, on the anterior aspect of it. And these are called flexor carpi ulnaris longus, flexor carpi radialis longus and flexor carpi ulnar, I can't remember the name. Flexor carpi radialis brevis and flexor carpi radialis longus. So that basically means that the muscles are right next to each other, but one is a short muscle, one is a long muscle, and they both do the same job. The word major versus minor, that basically means, is the muscle again big or small? So your chest muscle is pectoralis major, and if you lift that underneath it, deep to that, you have another muscle called pectoralis minor. So pectoralis major versus pectoralis minor. Next one, direction of the muscle fibers. So what direction do they go? Are they going straight up and down? Are they vertical? Then they're called rectus, the word rectus abdominis, like we keep talking about the six pack right in the middle of the chest. Transverse, transverse means they're going horizontally. So there is another layer of muscle in your belly called transverse abdominis. And we'll talk about that again when you guys look at the muscles in your lab. Oblique, oblique means comes in an angle. You have two layers of muscles inside your belly also called internal and external obliques, again, because they come in an angle. Number of origins. So every muscle typically have one origin. So one point of attachment to the muscle. Sorry, one point of attachment to the bone. Some muscles have multiple points of attachment. For example, when you talk about your bicep muscle, the muscle of your arm, biceps brachii, that has 2 points of attachment, because we all know that bi means two. Triceps brachii, the muscle that forms in the back of your arm, that means that muscle has 3 points of attachment, right? The word tri implies 3 points of attachment. And then shape. Shape basically, words like deltoid. Deltoid means triangular. You have this giant triangular muscle right over your shoulder, hence the name triangle, the name deltoid. Serratus. Serratus means seesaw pattern. So there is this seesaw pattern as you see on the side. So that basically means it's serrated, like a serrated knife, right? So same concept. But you also notice that serratus anterior also uses the location, right? As an anterior, it's in the front. Is this making sense, guys, when it comes to naming structures? Or naming muscles, I guess I should say. Any questions or clarifications so far? Great. Okay. So last but not least, we're going to talk about the concept of muscles in terms of how they use energy or how to create energy, and then how actively and how quickly they contract. So when we're thinking about production of ATP, which was our energy source for the cell, we typically think about presence of oxygen, right? Think about the mitochondria we talked about earlier in our first unit. We talked about mitochondria needing oxygen, right? And we said, if you do need oxygen to produce energy, we call that process aerobic process. Okay, aerobically, again, if you are not familiar with the word, make a notation for yourself. Aerobic or aerobically means in the presence of oxygen. Now, what is when you need oxygen to produce ATP? What is that process called? Or what is the muscle fibers that need oxygen to make their ATP? They're called oxidative fibers. Again, kind of think about this word. Oxy implies oxygen. So you need that oxygen. If you do not have oxygen present, you still can produce ATP. You use a process called anaerobic process as an absence of oxygen. And the actual process called glycolysis. Now again, in physiology, you learn a lot more about glycolysis and the steps involved. But for now, all we want to know is glycolysis doesn't need oxygen, so it's an anaerobic process. And the muscle fibers that use this technique are called glycolytic. And look at the similarity of the word. Glycolysis, so the muscles are called glycolytic. Now, make a notation for yourself. Aerobic process produces significant amount of ATP. Anaerobic process, which is the same thing as glycolysis, produces little ATP. So there is a difference why we have, as a whole, we have a preference to produce oxygen, to produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. Because the difference is 36 ATP versus 2 ATP. So there is a significant difference in terms of ATP production. The second concept, as I mentioned, when we're distinguishing muscles, is how quickly they contract. So typically, if a muscle is contracting fast, they're gonna get tired relatively fast because they use a lot of energy, typically. And if they're kind of taking their time to contract, then they can last a longer period of time because they don't burn as much energy in that short time. So based on that concept, we can divide muscles to 3 categories based on how they burn energy, how they produce energy, and how fast they contract. Now look at the names, guys. This is really self-explanatory, so don't make it more complicated. A slow oxidative fibers means they're gonna contract slowly and they use oxygen to produce their ATP. Fast glycolytic implies they're gonna contract rapidly and the mechanism they use is glycolysis to produce ATP. Fast oxidative implies that they're gonna contract rapidly. However, instead of, if you're looking at the method of ATP production, they're using the presence of oxygen. So pay attention to this question for me. If you're looking at these 3 categories of muscle, so a slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, and fast oxidative, which of these muscles need a lot of blood vessels in them? Which of these 3 categories need a lot of blood vessels in the muscle? Write your answer for me, please. I'll give you a minute. Okay. I want more than 1%. Okay. Again, the keyword here is, guys, which one of them is going to require a lot of blood vessels? So you cannot just say fast or slow, you have to give me a full name. So your options are a slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, or fast oxidative, or combination of those. Okay, so I see a lot of fast oxidative, and what's the other one? A slow oxidative, correct. So look at the word, guys. So for those who might have not figured this one out, let's take a look at it. When we're talking about blood vessels, what is the main thing your blood carries? What's the goal of having blood in your system? Carrying oxygen, right? So if you're thinking about oxidative, right, that automatically should say, I need a lot of oxygen. How do I carry oxygen? I need a lot of blood vessels, right? Simple. So if you're hearing the word oxidative, automatically you should think about, I need a lot of blood supply to that tissue, right? So blood supply, capillary network are going to be significant in both a slow oxidative, and fast oxidative. Now, the other thing is something called, and I'm going to type this for you guys so you have that, myoglobin, which is used in muscles to store oxygen. So myoglobin, okay? Myoglobin is a protein that is inside your muscle and it's used to store oxygen. The color of those is still gonna be red. So myoglobin, if you look at them under the microscope, they're red. So my question for you again, which of these muscles will be appearing red under the microscope because they have a significant amount of myoglobin? Which of these muscle or muscles will have a red color because they have a significant amount of myoglobin inside of them? Type your answer for me. Okay, good job, guys. Both a slow and fast oxidative muscles, right? Because again, what are we saying? We're saying that if you need oxygen, you need the storage of that oxygen. So both of these, which is a slow and fast oxidative, require a lot of myoglobin in them. Good job. Now, another question for you. Which one of these muscles, this is really simple, guys. Which of these muscles among these three rely on an anaerobic reaction? Relying on an anaerobic reaction. Remember what is anaerobic? Absence of oxygen. So which one is relying on an anaerobic? Fast glycolytic. Do you think, good job guys, do you think, let's look at the next question. Do you think fast glycolytic muscle get tired fast or slow? Does it get tired? It gets tired fast, right? Now, I'll tell you, and if you haven't figured this out, the main reason for them to get tired faster is because glycolysis produces very little energy, right? And you're gonna burn through that energy really fast. So you burn through energy relatively fast, your muscle gets tired fast. So let's take a look at the differences between these muscles, guys. Now we have more description. Now that you have kind of an idea, hopefully this will make more sense. Okay, so let's just start with a slow oxidative. They're red color due to abundant myoglobin, which we already established. They need that oxygen. We know based on the word oxidative that they are using aerobic reaction to get that oxygen, to get that ATP, sorry. They need a lot of mitochondria. Why, guys? Why do we need a lot of mitochondria? More ATP, correct. The more mitochondria is responsible for ATP. So if I want to produce more ATP, I need a lot of mitochondria. So they're richly supplied with capillaries. Why do I need capillaries? Why do I need those blood vessels, guys? Because blood vessels carry what for me? They carry oxygen for me. So if they're carrying oxygen, then they basically bring the oxygen, give it to my cells, my cell use it to make my ATP. So the word slow means they're gonna contract what? Slowly. So they are resistant to fatigue. So it takes a while for them to get tired. I don't need you guys to know the diameter of these muscles. However, I do want you guys to add that if I ask you for that example of a slow oxidative muscle, the best examples are the muscles of your back. So these are the muscles that help with your posture. So literally, kind of think about it. These muscles, if you want to hold your posture, and I know we don't always do that, but they need to be contracting continuously as far as you're awake. And then when you're sleeping, they can relax. But if you're standing or sitting or doing any type of activity, these muscles need to be engaged. So they basically need to be able to hold for a long time. Next type of muscles that we have is fast glycolytic. So again, kind of think about the words first. Don't jump, say, oh, I can't figure this out, I'm done. So they contain little myoglobin and a few mitochondria, right? Because both of these mean what? If I have myoglobin and mitochondria, what are those two immediately should trigger for you guys? That I need what? Oxygen, correct. But I'm saying what? I'm saying glycolytic, which means no oxygen, right? There is no oxygen involved in that. Again, you don't need to know the diameter of these muscles. It's not something I question you guys about it. You don't need to know this one also because it's it's a little bit beyond the scope of this class, mostly for physiology. It depends on an anaerobic pathway, which makes sense. And it's contract rapidly, as we decided, because we have the word fast, but they also get tired more rapidly. So one quick note on this. If I ask you guys, what is the typical color of a fast glycolytic fiber? Is it white or red? What would you say? It's white, correct. Because you don't have a lot of myoglobin, and you also don't have a lot of what, guys? Other than myoglobin, you don't have a lot of what? Not oxygen. But when you think about red color, what are you thinking about? Red color. Iron in the right track. Blood vessels, correct. A lot of blood vessels to the tissue. You don't send a lot of blood because you don't need that oxygen to the tissue, right? You don't need that high supply of oxygen to the tissue. So if you want to make sure you kind of get that in your head, that when we're talking about fast glycolytic muscle, the color is white, and it had it on the previous slide, is because little myoglobin, oops, sorry if I can't type, myoglobin and little limited blood vessel and capillaries. So we basically take everything that makes the typical muscle red. So kind of think about chicken breasts, right? Chicken breasts, because those are a typical chicken doesn't fly. It doesn't require a lot of blood supply. So they kind of flap their wing for a few seconds and they're done, right? So their muscles are not really actively being used for a long duration of the time. Versus if you compare it to a sparrow or hummingbird, then their chest muscle would be darker in color because they're actively flying and they're using those muscles for a long period of time. And then last but not least, we have fast oxidative. It's the best of the two words I basically got. Please mute yourself, whoever just joined us. Okay, so again, you don't need to know the diameter of these muscles. We do need to know that they do contract quickly, hence the word fast. And they are oxygen dependent, right? Because we're using the word oxidative. They are high in myoglobin content. So again, because they're oxidative and they do have a lot of blood vessels going to the tissue. But here's the difference, guys. Be very careful about this. They are somewhat fatigue resistant. So the reason they're fatigue resistant is because they are using a lot of energy, hence the word fast, right? They contract really rapidly, so they use a lot of energy, but they also what? Produce a lot of energy, exactly. So they use a lot of energy, but also produce it. So they have the supply and they're basically actively using that. Whoever just joined us, if you are joining for the first time, please make sure you sign in so you get the credit for being here. And here is the difference, so you can actually see the difference in terms of, again, this is kind of black and white, but it conveys the same point. You have a darker color, which is basically your slow fibers, versus the white color, those are your fast fibers. So you can see the difference. Now, in terms of the muscles that are your typical fast glycolytic muscles, these are your muscles that are used for jogging or resistance training. So these are the muscles that you basically train when you like, sorry, not jogging, I apologize, not jogging. Like, what is the like short runs, like fast runs that you burn through a lot of energy in a very short period of time, like a sprint, thank you. So that's fast glycolytic muscles. Just for a notation for you guys, most of the muscles that we have in our body are fast oxidative, which basically means that they are using a lot of energy, but they also are fatigue resistance typically. So if you're using jogging, for instance, biking, these are fast oxidative. So fast oxidative are muscles that you use for jogging or biking or when you run a marathon. So these are the muscles that you basically train, and they're the ones that are going to be actively getting bigger when you're undergoing these processes. Is this logical to you guys? Is this making sense? So a lot of time my students ask me like, okay, so but like, do we have a lot of them in one place, another one in the other place? You have to understand this, guys. You have these three type of muscles throughout your body and every muscle. The only difference is how much of it you have in each part and which one of these muscles do you train more often. So if somebody is training for a sprint, they're going to be focusing more on their fast glycolytic muscles. Somebody training for marathons, they're going to focus more on their fast oxidative muscles. You also have people that are just naturally good in running or lifting weight or doing resistance training, etc. And there is a genetic component to which of these muscles may predominate a group of your muscles, and as a result you be better at that. So if you have, for instance, if you have fast glycolytic muscles through genetic, then there's a good chance that you're going to be able to do sprint really well. If you have really a strong fast oxidative muscles, you might be good at more kind of long-term activities like jogging, biking, etc. But again, you can train each of these category of the muscles to improve over time. Okay, we are done with this one, this lecture at least. So I'm going to stop the recording.